My name is Dave McDowell, and I'm the one that had the idea for the Chandler Chuck Wagon Cook-off, and I'm the founder of that event. The goal of the American Chuck Wagon Association is to preserve and interpret the chuck wagon era, which they define as the period right after the Civil War, from about 1866 to 1886. As far as chuck wagon food for the cowboys job was pretty much the same regardless of what part of the country they were in, but a lot of things changed with the regions that they were working in. The trail drives were run by contractors, basically, that worked for the ranch owners. Contractors were tightwads, to put it bluntly, so they didn't spend any more money than they had to. And the cowboys weren't allowed to just kill a beef when they wanted, because that was money when it got to market. We cooked for 50 to 60 people. In Chandler, we've sold out of tickets a number of years in a row. Every wagon is preparing that many meals.
My name is Kevin Hartke. I'm the mayor of Chandler, Arizona, and I am here at Tumbleweed Park out at the ranch here today as we have a couple of our staff and aficionados setting up for the Chuck Wagon display this year. This has been a great event in the past where Chandler is able to pay homage to what is America's original food trucks, and where we have seen some great food come out of Dutch ovens and other camping type venues. The food has been excellent. We're all saddened that this year, that although because of COVID we're not able to do this, this is a very important part of our heritage of the Southwest, and Chandler has done a great job of presenting these, and we look forward to continuing to bring forth the Chuck Wagon Cook-offs in the future.
Chandler, Arizona Cook-off is probably the best run cook-off that my wife and I have attended.
Of all of the cook-offs across the state, Chandler is by far one of my favorite. Just with the atmosphere, the grass, the camaraderie with everyone.
Well, this event, the Chandler Cook-off, is one of the best events. The staff here is wonderful, the location is wonderful. Chandler has a great history in Western and agriculture, and a lot of people come out and see things that they wouldn't normally see.
This is the biggest cook-off in Arizona right now. There's only one other one that's down in Sonoyta. This has actually become one of the larger ones in the country. During the Chuck Wagon Cook-offs, there's generally two different competitions. One of them is authenticity. We set up the wagon authentically with a lot of antiques, and then there's a list of stuff that the judges have that takes and says, you know, you have to have these specific things and you get points for those. This camp is set up more like a true trail drive. We don't have a lot of tables, or actually any tables. In reality, the fly probably wouldn't even be put up, hardly at all. The fly, instead of being a big canvas tarp, is actually the sheet that goes over the bows on the wagon. The fire set up here, during a trail drive, there was always coffee going if they were in camp. And then we have beans, and the main things that they would have eaten on the trail would have been biscuits, beans, and coffee. Sometimes they lucked out and got other stuff, and meat too. They didn't eat a lot of beef because beef is what they were taken to sell. They ate a lot of game animals, and the beef that they did eat generally were beef that were killed because of some problem. They broke a leg or something like that and had to be put down. The wagons themselves, they would have been any type of a wagon that they had on the ranch. Some of them, this is a thin wheeled wagon. Some of them are real thick, but whatever they had on the ranch, they wouldn't have gone and bought a special wagon just to take up the trail. Whatever they had, they would have adapted it. Every one of the chuck boxes were built a little bit different. If the cook had a chance to put his input into it, or he made it himself, he would have made it to his dimensions. So if he was a short person, it wouldn't have been as tall as this. My wife has a hard time getting up into the top ones, or top drawers, and if it was a tall person, it would be taller. But a lot of times the cook would be brought on after the chuck box was made, didn't really have a lot of input into it. When the chuck wagons came into a camp, they would have set up, and generally the only thing they would have got out is the stuff that they absolutely had to have. The cooks were extremely efficient in the sense of, why take and empty the bed when all you need is the stuff that's already in your chuck box. As far as judging a wagon, there are certain things that are on the list that the judges have to check off. You have to have the eating utensils for 10 people. All of our plates are actual plates. Everything is the gray enamel. You have to have 2 lanterns. During competition, they would be burning. The bottle of whiskey, lard is required, sugar. The cans are not really required, but again, that adds to it. The clock, tobacco, the coffee is the Arbuckle's coffee that we have. Arbuckle's was the first to come out with actually roasted coffee. Before they came out, they would get what they called green beans, and they'd have to actually roast them over the fire in a skillet before they could even grind them. Now, the one neat thing with Arbuckle's is that from the very beginning, they had candy cane inside the bag. And one of the ways that the cook would get someone to take and grind the coffee was say, who wants a candy? And you'd have one of the cowboys with a sweet tooth come over and grind the coffee for them. A meat saw is required. Looking at this side of the wagon, as far as authenticity, the judges would take and check each of the wheels, and they'd move it a little bit to make sure that there's a little bit of give, but not too much. They check and make sure that these are all tight. They'll normally take and have the owner of the wagon undo the brake to make sure that the brake pads work. We've got a grease can here because the wheels do have to be greased. So funny on watching the movies is that when a wheel falls off, it's the worst thing in the world. But every 50 to 100 miles, they'd have to stop, pull each of the wheels off, grease them, and put them back on. So it wasn't that they went forever without pulling them off. This one, we've got a frying pan, which is one of the required things. There's a big controversy with the chuck wagon people as far as what size coffee grinder you should have. My thinking is that whatever they had at the ranch is what they'd put on this, because a lot of times they just take whatever supplies they had from the ranch and load it up. But it does have to be able to grind coffee. Now we're at the front of the wagon, and it has to have everything for 2 horses. You have to have a full harness along with the reins and the collars. You've got to have a seat, and this is the only suspension on the entire wagon. Everything else is hard. A jockey box for some of the tools and some of the stuff that would have dealt with the rigging. You've got stay chains that you have to have and get it where one horse is pulling a little bit stronger than another horse, that you can pull them back or adjust them so that they pull evenly. Now we're on the left side of the wagon, and one of the requirements in each of the authenticity competitions is you have to have a wash station set up. And you want to have it on this side of the wagon because you've got the barrel here. There's some of the documentation that there's only one toothbrush used by everybody. Now, rope was really important. There's some times that they would have to pull the wagons across rivers, but they'd also take and when they gathered the horses in the morning and maybe even other times of the day, they'd actually make corrals. They'd have the horses all in one area right up close to the chuck wagon. This is a toolbox that's got the smaller tools. This is a maul. You can split wood with this as well as having a sledgehammer, because you want to keep down the equipment as much as possible. And then you've got a horseshoeing setup, because the horses would have to be reshoed fairly frequently. And so this has all of the stuff shoeing. They would have probably had a lot more horseshoes, but this works for us. You have to have a branding iron and then a triangle to call the cowboys in. Some other stuff that's required for the authenticity part. This is a cowboy teepee. It's debatable whether or not it was used real frequently, but it was used on some of the drives, and it doesn't have a floor in it or anything, so it is period correct. You have to have at least 2 bedrolls. During the early part of the trail drives, the cowboys were lucky to have one either quilt or blanket and some type of canvas to wrap it up in. There's a lot of documentation talking about only having one quilt or blanket, and a lot of times what they'd actually use is their horse blanket, and the horse blanket actually was a horse blanket. It's a full-size blanket, and you just fold it, stick it on underneath the saddle as a pad. You do have to have a saddle with all of the different stuff that goes along with it. I've got this set up more as for the boss or the scout, because they would take and have one individual ride out ahead of the herd, determine where they were going to camp and that, and he may be out overnight. So we would have had just a canvas sheet on the back instead of all the full bedroll, and then had his horse blanket underneath the horse and been able to wrap up in that, along with the saddlebags. And normally in competitions I'd have my 1 or 2 rifles out, along with a couple of pistols also. And then obviously a canteen that would go along with that. This would have been for the cook. Now there were women that actually went on some of the trail drives. And the ones that had women go along, generally there was some type of a tent that they would sleep in. The stuff I've shown you is the authenticity part of a Chuck Wagon Cook-off. The cooking competition is not true representation of the Chuck Wagon period, because they have to take and cook for the public, and no one's going to eat just beans and biscuits and coffee, or at least pay for it.
A lot of people associate chili with the Chuck Wagon Cook-off, but they're 2 different animals. Chili came about and was around, and there were chilies used on the Chuck Wagon, but I don't think the cook made chili per se. In a cook-off, we judge on 5 items: meat.
I'm cooking some beef tips and green chili gravy.
So beef stew is a nice hearty dish.
This is my red chili. It's chili Colorado.
Beans, predominantly pinto beans were the go-to thing, but in New Orleans you might have had red beans. In the northern states you might have had northern white beans, but pintos were predominantly the bean of choice for Southwest Chuck Wagon cooks. And canned goods came into play toward the end of the Chuck Wagon era, and canned tomatoes were popular on a Chuck Wagon. It's quite possible that the cook put canned tomatoes in his beans. Chili peppers were available in all the border states, so he could have had chili peppers in there. Salt pork could have been added to the beans. So that kind of made the beans a bigger dish. They ate a lot of beans.
We did southwestern beans today, which are black beans, onions, garlic, some corn, green chili, and tomato and red pepper.
Bread, regional differences come into play big time in bread. In Texas, the Texas state bread is pan de campo, which is a flat bread that's cooked in a Dutch oven. They also would have done cornbread because white flour wasn't available, so cornbread would have been a reasonable alternative. There were ranchers that ran sheep as well. The sheep herders on the ranch did a salt rising bread in a Dutch oven that was basically a loaf bread, similar to Irish soda bread.
Our cornbread this year, last year we won second place here at Chandler. We jazzed it up a little bit, put green chili in it. I think the secret ingredient to everything is sugar, and so it won second prize. And we went easy on the corn meal and added flour, so it wasn't quite as heavy.
As you moved further west and north, you had white flour available. They would have done biscuits. Baking powder came available during the end of the Chuck Wagon era, so they did baking powder biscuits, they did sourdough biscuits.
The biscuits are a very simple recipe, flour and butter. We do a little layer of honey. When milk sours or spoils, it's not a big deal when you cook it, so we use that in our biscuits as well.
As far as potatoes on the Chuck Wagon go, potatoes are a judged item in a modern cook-off, but potatoes were seldom carried on a Chuck Wagon unless they encountered a farmer along the way that had some that they traded something for. Potatoes were bulky, they were heavy. One of the main problems with the Chuck Wagons was weight. The more weight you put on, the harder it is to move the wagon down the trail. So potatoes, even though they're a modern cook-off judged item, were seldom carried on a Chuck Wagon. They used a lot of things in place of potatoes. They did dumplings, beef with dumplings. They did rice. Rice was really available in Texas and closer to New Orleans as they got down there. Anything that they could use to stretch the beef and fill the cowboys' bellies was what they went to. Desserts on the Chuck Wagon were based primarily on dried fruit. And so dried fruit could have been apples, it could have been apricots. Prunes were used a lot because they were cheap. And with those, the cook did puddings, cobblers, pies. The go-to desserts was a rice pudding with raisins called spotted pup. Depending upon the skill of the cook, there were great desserts. Some did pies, some did fried pies, but cobblers were probably the main go-to thing.
I have peach trees at home, so I already cut up the peaches last year and got them all prepared and just make a peach cobbler.
Generally at the Chandler Chuck Wagon Cook-off, we provide a 30-pound top round roast basically, and the cook's job is to figure out how they're going to prepare that beef. Everybody is given the same beef, so the dishes start out the same, but it's up to the creativity and abilities of the cook to turn that into something that the judges will like. We have 3 judges for each food item, so we have a total of 15 judges. Spices on a Chuck Wagon early on were very limited. They had the basics, but the basics were different in the early days. Sugar did not come in a bag, and it was not ground and processed. It was what they called cone sugar, and you had to chop off a chunk and pulverize it to be able to use it. So salt and pepper were certainly available, and nutmeg, cinnamon, and all those things were available in the general market. Now, just because they were available in the general market to the general population doesn't mean they were carried on the Chuck Wagon or on every Chuck Wagon. But there were spices available, and they were used by the cook. Primarily probably cinnamon, salt, pepper, sugar, and those sort of things. Not a lot of exotic spices like we have today, like Chinese 5-spice or anything like that. Chili peppers were available, especially in Texas, all along the border. In Arizona and Texas, you have a native pepper that's native to Arizona called the chiltepin or bird pepper. It's a pepper that is smaller than a pea, but it's very intense. It's very hot. When I do pasoli, which is a pork hominy stew sort of thing, I put 3 or 4 chiltepins in there, and that heats that pot up. So they're very intense. But there were chili peppers that came into New Mexico and Arizona with the Spanish when they sent the conquistadors up through the area. The chili peppers became a popular item here, and they were certainly available and used. Dairy products were not really carried on a chuck wagon. Number one, they had no way to keep milk cold. They had no way to keep butter from melting and dripping away. And when they were doing roundups and that sort of thing, coming out of a ranch and going for a few days, especially along the border with the Mexican influence, they might have had cheese. But in talking with chuck wagon historians, they haven't found any documentation of cheese being carried on a chuck wagon. So dairy products, even though in a modern cook-off they're allowed, and some events, even Chandler, because we have the Dairy Council as a sponsor, we provide milk and butter and those sort of things. But dairy, milk, butter, eggs were not seen to a great extent on a chuck wagon. As far as how many the cook on a chuck wagon had to cook for, in the trail drives, there were 10 or 12 hands involved. So he wouldn't have had all the equipment that you see here today. He would have had 2 Dutch ovens, a skillet, a coffee pot, and maybe a couple other pots.
We dug the holes, and then we pounded these stakes in that holds up our iron. Basically, it's all cooked by wood. And we use oak and we use mesquite, and that gives us the best coals. And this heavy iron will hold this heavy cast iron up, so it needs to be heavy iron to hold up to this heavy weight. Everything's time period, wood handles. This goes to a harness. 3 or so years ago, there was a fella that came from Montana here that competed, and he had one of these, and he kind of rigged this end. This is a Dutch oven lifter, and so you can do this, and it takes the lids off.
We'll create a big hole, have a lot of fire, and then we can grab the coals using this shovel here. It's got holes in it. The reason there's holes in it is for competition, especially on a Dutch oven or any Dutch oven cooking. You don't want to insulate the ovens with ash. You want the hot coals. So when you get to grab the coals here, you just sort of move the shovel around, all the ash falls through the holes, and then you have hot coals, which you then put on the oven.
Once you have the campfire pit, and then the rocks keep everything sort of in, we can set our coffee pots on them, our butter pots and things like that. And you know, it just works for me. So we have cooked everywhere and anywhere, from the state capitol steps to on top of mountains, and
don't want to be digging a pit every time.
No, it's just easier. When you're working around the campfire, it's nice to have things that are a little bit longer. So, you know, the longer paddles and mashers are really helpful. We have a nice, beautiful spatula over here that a buddy of mine made. Yeah, the rule is if it's metal, it's hot, so don't touch it.
We just have to test.
So again, then you can stand a little bit further back from the fire, because it doesn't matter if it's 50 degrees outside, it's about 1500 by the fire. Big rule, nothing goes on the ground. So the lids stay cleaner to keep them on our stands.
In competitions, the health department monitors us, comes by and inspects us. So we have to be very careful. We have to make sure all our cold items are in an ice chest and they're covered with ice and they're at the proper temperature. They don't like grass or dust or dirt, so we gotta make sure a cooking or a preparation area, we have some type of matted or carpeted surface that's on there. Of course, we gotta make sure we have a fire extinguisher close by. We gotta make sure that when we serve that we have follow the proper hygienes and make sure our hands are clean and they're covered with hand coverings, gloves, plastic gloves. But it is monitored very carefully when we are cooking in a competition where we're providing food for many people.
It's all trial and error, all this cooking. And what's been really different cooking this way versus coals is it's hard to judge the heat. With a charcoal, you can cook easier. With a campfire, it's just by the seat of your pants.
Weather's a factor, wind is a factor. You don't have a knob to turn on high and low. So there are a lot of different factors that affect the outcome of your cooking. So it's very challenging, not just from the competition standpoint, but competing with yourself. And what is very, very gratifying is the comments that you get from people saying, oh, that was great. And children that come up and say, you're actually cooking this there on that fire. And so that part of it is the most gratifying, I think, of cooking on a chuck wagon.
Chandler is a huge support of kids staying in the chuck wagon realm, and so we also do a kids cook-off alongside of our chuck wagon cook-off. And it is so much fun. Shelby started cooking in Dutch ovens when she was 8.
I was really lucky when I was younger, when Mom got into the Dutch oven cooking, that I was kind of forced to do it with her because I was young. And it's, like she said, just super unique. No one else that I know does stuff like this. And as I've gotten older, I've definitely learned to appreciate it more. I think that I'm really lucky that I'm gonna be able to continue to keep the tradition of chuck wagon and Dutch oven cooking
The Dutch
going.
ovens are in the will.
The Dutch ovens are what?
In the will.
Yeah, yeah. There's sheds of Dutch ovens that are gonna be left to me, so I'll have to put them to good use.
I feel like it's a kind of a lost art, dying breed, across the United States. And if we don't keep doing this, it's just gonna disappear.
In today's world, it's really important to preserve history and the heritage of our forefathers. And so it's just important to keep that alive.
People really enjoy coming out, looking at the wagons, enjoying the food, and spending a day with the family in an event like this.
This is the only one that's a real full competition with the authenticity and the cooking part.
I look at all these wagons and their families. A lot of families come out and spend time with one another. It's just a good, clean, fun activity. And it's something, it's better than sitting home and watching TV.
It is just so much fun to share the outdoors and the Old West and food with people.
I really enjoy chuck wagon cooking. Number one, for the people involved in it. It's a great group of people. It's a great camaraderie. Even though it's a competition, people in chuck wagon cooking stop and talk to the public. They interact with them. You're constantly barraged with questions. So, you're trying to measure flour and put it in, and people are asking you questions. So it's challenging from that standpoint, but just talking to the people and the people involved is great.
Chandler providing the opportunity where we have a competition where we can teach a little history of preparation of food. I think it's valuable, and I'm really proud that Chandler does it. I think we have a little piece of history here, and very proud that we're able to provide that.